Welcome to the first in a series of video articles on how to use writing short stories to find your writing process. Now, the first question that might raise is the question, what is a writing process? What do I mean by that? Here's my one paragraph description that I came up with, and it's the combination of methods, habits, and approaches that a writer uses to take an initial idea and develop it and turn it into a finished piece of writing. There's one other important element that we need to add though, and the writing process needs to be repeatable. We don't want to be a writer like Harper Lee, although we'd all love to write a book that was as revered as To Kill a Mockingbird has been, but she never wrote anything else, and the only other thing that she wrote she didn't want published, and it wasn't particularly well received when it was published after her death. So, and J.D. Salinger was another guy like that. He wrote Catcher in the Rye, didn't really write much after. And so for me, I don't want to write one story. I've got 11 long form projects sitting on hard drives or in the dusty parts of my brain that I want to get out. So for me, the goal for finding my writing process, developing it, optimizing it, is to get to those ideas and to get those written and get them out there. Now, a writing process contains multiple steps. This is quite a high level overview of it. The first step is obviously coming up with the idea for the story itself, so ideation. Next, outlining or planning, and I've written in brackets if you're an outliner. Discovery writers might not do much work in terms of outlining and planning, but from what I know of talking with people who are discovery writers, reading interviews with people who are discovery writers, they often spend an amount of time kind of chewing over the idea in their brains, going for walks, letting the ideas kind of bounce around before they sit down and start writing. The actual writing itself is obviously part of your writing process. Then an important part of the writing process is revision, and then publishing, whether you're self-publishing or whether you're going to publish short stories to magazines, submit them to try and get them published in those places, or whether you're going to self-publish, whether it's long form or short form. Publishing is another part of the writing process. And then the final important part is that you go back to step one when you've finished, when your work's out there, either it's published and people are buying it and reading it, or you're waiting to hear from agents and or magazine editors or publishing houses whether they're going to publish your book, is to go back to step one and go to ideation, so the process starts again with the next story. Now, the writing process is unique for every writer. If we take the example of Stephen King or Lee Childs, they're both what's known as discovery writers. That means they sit down, they start writing. In King's case, he comes up with a character or a series of characters or an event, and he writes forward from there. Lee Childs says he does very similar, but often he has a vague idea of where the story is going. If we compare and contrast with James Patterson and Jeffrey Deaver, both thriller writers, I don't know if that's a coincidence or not, but they are detailed outliners. Jeffrey Deaver's outlines are so detailed that when he comes to the writing phase, he can actually write out of order, because he chooses to write, when he goes to his writing desk, he goes, what scene that's left to be written am I most excited to come to the computer with and write today? And he writes that wherever it is in the outline. So he doesn't write chronologically, because his outlines are so detailed that everything's tied together. So a really interesting process. But the important point is, each of those two categories of writers are extreme ends of a spectrum. And you don't have to be a discovery writer or a detailed outliner. You can fall in between. And probably most people do fall somewhere in between. Science fiction and fantasy writer Brandon Sanderson has a series of lectures which are free on YouTube. They're very good. I recommend all fiction writers, aspiring fiction writers, even published fiction writers should watch them and try and find things that they can take from them to improve their writing. But he talked about how, and he was the first person who verbalized the idea for me that it's a spectrum. And so one way this could work with short stories, because the focus for us is on short stories, although we will mention longer form through the course of this article and this series. But for short stories, maybe you've got like 5 plot points. So you've got the beginning, 2 or 3 plot points that happen in the middle, and then the ending or the conclusion of the story. And that might be enough for you to sit down and start writing, even though you don't know the details of how you're going to get from point 1 to point 2 or point 2 to point 3. So you might have a little bit of outlining in that form and then do discovery writing to join those plot points up, or those character points, whatever they are. Again, it's about finding what works for you and doubling down on the things that work for you. When you actually write is another of those elements that's unique to different authors. So, for example, Stephen King writes first thing in the morning. Lee Childs writes later in the day, often in the early evening. And Charles Dickens used to write late into the night. He was famous for walking the streets of London at like 9 p.m, 10 p.m, whatever time it was, going for a walk and then coming back and then working late into the night on his stories. One little tangent to explore very quickly is about the connection with walking and writing. There's an interview with Stephen King in Rolling Stone magazine around 2014, 2015, I think. If you Google it, you'll find it. And was asked his writing routine, and at that point he used to wake up, have coffee, something to eat, and then go for a walk, I think 60 to 90 minutes, and then he'd come home and then he would start writing. So there's something about walking and writing, walking and creativity. There's some connection there. So maybe that's something that you could explore. Lots of people talk about it. The point is to explore different things and try and come up with things that make the process easier for you. What to write with is also another one of those things that different writers do. J.K. Rowling, among others, she often writes first draft by hand. Kevin Anderson, the science fiction writer, has written a lot of Dune books with Frank Herbert's son. He dictates his novels. Before the proliferation of voice-to-text apps, which you can get free on your smartphones now, and they're pretty good quality, the iPhone actually ships with an app called Notes, which is very, very good quality, and you could dictate straight to Notes without paying for anything. It's really good. But he used to have a proper dictation machine, the portable dictation machine that he used to go hiking in the mountains with, or the woods near his house. Notice there's a connection with walking again. And he used to dictate so much that he used to keep 2 secretaries employed full-time dictating all of the words, transcribing all of the words that he dictated on those tapes. And then there's multiple authors who write using computer keyboards, and they might have different kinds of softwares, Word, Scrivener, whatever it is you use. Some of these different things you might already know. You might already know that you're a discovery writer, or that you're a hybrid, and you do a bit of outlining, and then you discover to link points. You might already know that you prefer dictating, or you prefer writing by longhand or using a computer, whatever it is. But if you don't, and you don't have a preference, then it's definitely worth trying out some of these other ways, because you might find a way that really works for you. Like dictation, if you can get used to writing via dictation, is probably one of the quickest ways to actually get words on paper. But I'm not saying you should. I actually write using a computer keyboard, although I do use dictation for some non-fiction writing that I do as well. So you've got to try and experiment and find out what works for you. There's other writing considerations as well you've got to take into account. Are you going to embrace the mentality of shitty first drafts and get it all out there? Or are you going to be a bit more considered and embrace the concept of living first drafts and try and produce the best first draft that you can? Are you going to write in first person or third person? Or are you going to alternate? There are books out there now. James Patterson has written some thriller books where a lot of it's written from the first person viewpoint of the detective, and I'm thinking of the Alex Cross series, but then when he wants to use the viewpoint of the murderer or the killer, he uses third person or limited third person for that. So you've got both viewpoints in the same kind of book. And I think that's, when I first read that, I found that just a little bit strange getting used to, but I think it's much more common now. So you can combine both in the same book. Genres, are you going to be a horror writer, or are you going to be a science fiction or fantasy or mystery or whatever it is? Or are you going to have a hybrid blend? I find myself coming up with ideas for a lot of stories which are kind of like detective stroke suspense stories, but have a supernatural setting and background as well. So that's some kind of urban dark fantasy, I'm guessing. Story length is another thing. You might naturally not naturally aim, but you might naturally be drawn to short stories, or writing shorter, like Ray Bradbury, who I've mentioned many times. He wrote lots of short stories in his lifetime. Even his novels are quite short. Fahrenheit 451, Something Wicked This Way Comes are quite short books. I don't know that either of them top 50 or 60,000 words. Or you might be like a Brandon Sanderson and aim at 300,000 word mammoth books. So you might find that those are the kind of books you want to write, and your writing process as you develop it has to support creating sufficient ideas to write at length and to get you through to the process of starting and actually finishing. Revision is another important thing to work on, something I'm particularly weak on, I would say. Different revision strategies range from reading your work out from a printout and then marking the printout up, to revising it on the computer, which is not something I would ever do personally, but if that works for you, it works for you. To some people print it out but have the computer read it out, and then they revise from there. Some people use editors to make revision notes. There's lots of different ways. Again, you've got to find the way that works for you. So we're going to talk about now what you need to find for the writing process that works for you. Now, before we go into more of the detail, you need to define what works for you means. And that's defined by your goals. So if you want to write a novel a year, then the writing process needs to be built and developed to support that goal. If you want to write a short story a week, like Ray Bradbury, as I've spoken about several times already in my video articles, then your writing process needs to support that. And so the difference between writing a short story a week and a novel a year, if you let's say you wrote 5,000 words a week on a short story, that would easily support most novel lengths. The difference is, or one of the primary differences, apart from the length itself, with a short story a week, you've got to come up with a bang new, fresh idea every week. With a novel, you've got to come up with an idea that's got enough depth and breadth to support a 150,000 word story. So again, the writing process for those two writers looks slightly different. You might be a screenplay writer. You might want to write 2 screenplays a month, or a screenplay a month, or a screenplay every 2 months. But whatever it is, you've got to try and tailor your writing process so it supports your end goals. So, how do you actually go about finding your writing process? Well, the obvious answer to that question is by trial and error and by doing writing. At the end of the day, it's not something where you can go, I'm going to be a discovery writer and I'm going to use this method of creating ideas, and when I've finished I'm going to use this method of revising, and etc. etc. You've actually you can't design your writing process from start to finish without getting in the trenches and writing and seeing what works, doubling down on what works, finding out what doesn't work and getting rid of that. So there's going to be a lot of trial and error in writing, but you've got 2 approaches that you can take. There's either a long form approach or a short form approach. And this series is about fast tracking the process as much as possible. And that means that we're going to use short form fiction as a way of finding the writing process. Now, again, going back to Brandon Sanderson's series of lectures, he talks about that he wrote 5 novels before he got to a novel that he considered was good enough to be, that he could then go through the process of trying to find an agent and then getting it submitted to publishing houses. And interestingly, over the course of those novels, the element that he said was most responsible for getting it to that quality level, which he was slow to really work on, was revision. So I was thinking about that on a previous slide when I said it's one of my weaknesses that I know about, so I'm going to have to work on in this series. But 5 novels is maybe 4 or 5 years of work, and if your goal is to write novels and you take the approach that you're going to learn to write novels by writing novels, you have to accept that you might have to write for several years before you start getting to the quality level that you want. But with short stories, because the completion cycle, and deliberately writing the short stories, the completion cycle is so much shorter in terms of from going from idea to going, right, I've finished with that story, I'm going to try and get it published, or it's not quite good enough to publish, I'll move on to the next. That process is so much quicker because not only can you use a number of short stories to discover your process, so you've got a process that supports you, so you get an idea and you can go from idea to writing the end, but you can also use the short story process to improve your writing as you're writing in a much quicker way than you can with novels. Because with novels, you can't. So, for example, let's say you're taking the long form approach and you write a 100,000 word novel. You can't stop at 30,000 words and go, right, I'm going to revise all this, work out what elements I'm weak in. Is it dialogue? Is it writing scenes? Is it action scenes? Is it description? Whatever it is, and then go away and do some practice exercises to improve those elements before you then carry on with the novel. Whereas with a short story, as you're starting to get your writing process down, you can take a short story, let it sit for a while, and while you're letting it sit, you can write another couple of short stories so that you can come back to it with fresh eyes, and then you can go through it and revise it, but revise it through the lens of what can I improve. And then, as well as doing your fiction writing, you can have a certain amount of time per day, and it doesn't have to be very much. That's topics for another series of videos in the future, by the way. But you can identify a topic and work on it and improve it. And because the short story writing cycle is so much shorter, your improvement in quality can be much faster than if you take the long form approach. So that's why I've chosen to start off with short stories. So not only am I going to be using it to honing my writing process, I've got an idea of the things where I'm strong, where I'm weak, what kind of writer I'm likely to be, though I'm going to do some experimenting. But the reason I've gone for short stories is it will be a much quicker way of raising the quality of my writing. So I think I've discovered short verse, actually just talked about short versus long. So we mentioned short stories, by definition, shorter completion cycles. 5,000 words is much easier to actually experiment with than 50,000 or 100,000. It's not only that you can go, right, I'm going to experiment with first person, and you might find after 1 or 2 short stories that you don't like first person and you want to be a third person writer. If you experiment with first person on an 80,000 word novel, and you get 30,000 words in and you decide you don't like it, you've got to junk 30,000 words. And if you write 5,000 words a week, that is 6 weeks worth of work, whereas it's 1 week for a story, and you found in 1 week's worth of writing, I don't like first draft, I can write in third draft. So everything moves much faster when you work in these shorter completion cycles. I think that even if you want to write long, the quickest path to that is to start short, and that's because of these shorter completion cycles allow you to identify problems to fix. And I reckon that if you took 100,000 words of a novel with a writer who writes 100,000 words novel, and then when he's finished, revises it, identifies where he's weak, identifies what has helped him with his writing process, and you compare it with a writer who started out at the same point and wrote 100,000 words of 5,000 word short stories. So only 20 short stories in the same time that the novelist wrote his 100,000 words in one novel length story, but that the short story writer is consciously going back to stories, revising them, identifying weaknesses, fixing those weaknesses. I think you'd find the short story writer's progress would be more like that, and the novel writer's progress, the curve would be much shallower. So that's why I'm starting off with short, and I intend, when I get to a quality level that I'm happy with, that I will then start moving to long. A couple of my long form projects are actually serial stories, so I'll start by moving to them, and then I'll start thinking about long form work and actually novels itself. So that's the overview of using short stories as a way of fast tracking your story writing process. Also, as well as fast tracking your writing process, it can also fast track your writing ability, which is a separate thread and a separate track. In the next episode, we're going to talk some more about planning versus discovery and the spectrum of how you fall on that, and how you might start actually trying to work out if you're a plotter or if you're a discovery, and trying to work out where you fall on the spectrum, so you can then make that a repeatable process for future stories. Until then, if you've got any questions or thoughts on this, drop me an email, paul@deliberate-practice.com. I'd be interested in your feedback on this. I think is a really interesting topic that not many writers talk about. When I say not many writers, I mean published authors. They say you've got to find your writing process, and that's it. They don't say anything about how you might go about doing it. And I want to hone mine, and I thought, what better way than documenting it. And actually, I'm going to be documenting it in my monthly membership, which is called the Writing Vault, writing-vault.com, and there'll be a link in the description. In July, I'm going to start writing 2 short stories a week, and I'm going to publish those stories in the vault, and I'm also going to publish all the stuff that goes alongside the stories. So there'll be some revision drafts, there'll be some different drafts of the stories, so that you can see how I've revised, and I'll talk about how I've revised it. I'll talk about how I came up with the ideas, whether I outlined, whether it was more discovery, where this character starts here doing this and they're going to get to here. So all that's going to be chronicled in the Writing Vault, but there's a whole load of other resources for writers as well. So do check that out. That might be something that's worth the $7 a month that it costs for the subscription. But there's a 3 free things that you get as a thank you for subscribing that are worth multiples of that $7. Check out the sales page, see what you think. If you've got thoughts on it or questions on it, use the email address and send me a question, and I'll answer it as honestly as I can. I'm not trying to trick people into anything, but it might be something that interests you. Anyway, that's this episode. So we'll continue in the next episode when we start talking about outlining and discovery writing.